The Fitzroy Football Club, whether you know them by the Maroons, Gorillas or Lions, are one of the most historic and proud teams in Australian football history. But how did a once powerhouse VFL team go from winning 8 premierships to playing in the local leagues of Melbourne? Throughout the early 1800s, the people of the rapidly growing suburb of Fitzroy were unhappy with the fact that they had no Aussie rules team to call their own. So in September of 1883, nearly 70 people gathered in the Brunswick Street Hotel and set about forming their own team. The committee was headed by son of former Fitzroy Mayor John McMahon and Secretary J.H. Simpson. One of the first decisions made was on the uniform, with the group deciding on maroon and blue, which in 1883 was not obtainable in the colony of Victoria, so the jerseys had to be ordered from England. The next move was to submit an application to join the most prominent league of their time, the VFA, and they were accepted to play. The club was initially ridiculed by the press, and even local residents who believed it was impossible to start a new club. However, the club did prevail in one of its first matches against juggernaut Melbourne, beating them 4-1, and in turn garnering a greater deal of respect among the football landscape, which was only furthered by beating Carlton a week later, with them being clearly established on the footballing scene. They would finish the season with 7 wins, 8 losses and 1 draw. Some people may notice an asterisk next to their drawn game, leading to this: match drawn, ball lost in lake. Yes, the ball was lost in the lake and the game could not go ahead, leaving the game resulting in a draw. Imagine this happening today. It wouldn't even happen in the 7th division of a local league. The form would continue to leave them around 5th to 10th most years until in 1895, where they would win the VFA Premiership, the ultimate prize in the game at that point. However, just one season later, the 6 strongest clubs in the league in Essendon, Collingwood, Melbourne, South Melbourne, Geelong and Fitzroy would break away to form their own league called the Victorian Football League, or VFL. They would also invite an additional 2 teams, Carlton and St Kilda, who were considered weaker teams on the field, and the latter invited mainly for access to the Junction Oval. Fitzroy would finish the inaugural season in 6th, the last of the main teams, with half as many wins as South Melbourne above them. They would improve into 1898 and would have a shot at the premiership run with one of the most confusing final systems ever. Regardless, Fitzroy would qualify for the semi-final by way of being at the top of the Section A ladder and would face Collingwood, who they would beat narrowly by 11 points, setting up a match-up for the first ever grand final against the reigning premiers in Essendon, who they had beaten a few weeks prior in the sectional rounds, and they were fortunate enough to repeat their triumph, becoming VFL premiers. And their success didn't stop there. They lost just 3 games in the whole 1899 season and waltzed into a grand final where they beat South Melbourne by a single point. Fitzroy would again lose just 3 games in the regular season. However, this time they lost a single sectional game. But as they were minor premiers, it hardly mattered, and they were into a 3rd straight grand final, looking to become the first team to win a three-peat in the VFL. And with a lead of 2 points at half-time, it looked well on track. And despite Fitzroy's best efforts and keeping Melbourne to just 2 points in the 4th quarter, they narrowly missed out by just 4 points. The effects of a grand final hangover were certainly felt, and Fitzroy dropped to 6th place behind only the league's 2 cellar dwellers, Carlton and St Kilda. Come 1903, Fitzroy were back into a grand final where they lost by 2 points to Collingwood. They bounced back the next year though, and were minor premiers, losing just 4 games and making it into the grand final against Carlton, who they beat 61-37, claiming the club's 3rd VFL flag. 1905 would be more of the same as Fitzroy continued their dominance of the early league, finishing 2nd overall and beating Collingwood 30-17 in the grand final. In 1913, they became minor premiers and faced off in the grand final against St Kilda, which they lost but replayed and won under the right of reply rule. But nonetheless, Fitzroy would win their 5th premiership, after which they would return to being around 4th to 7th on the ladder, until in 1916, with World War I at its height, many clubs would not play in the season, leaving only Fitzroy, Collingwood, Richmond and Carlton. This led to an interesting situation where Fitzroy won both the Wooden Spoon and Premiership, finishing 4th but winning through the final series. Although in official AFL sources, the finals results were later counted and Richmond declared winners of the Wooden Spoon. Fitzroy settled back into mediocrity once more until in 1922 they would reach grand final, winning it, twice actually due to the same right of reply rule from earlier. But Essendon would get revenge the following year as they beat Fitzroy for the Premiership. Despite the on-field brilliance of Hayden Bunton Sr. winning 3 Brownlow medals for the club in the 1930s and early 1940s, the club wouldn't reach the final series again until 1943, even picking up a Wooden Spoon in 1936. 1944 would be a different story for the team now nicknamed the Gorillas, reaching the grand final and winning an 8th premiership against Richmond, and things were looking good for them. However, the following year they would miss finals, slipping to 6th, then 8th, but recovered in 1947, finishing 3rd and making it a prelim. However, this would prove to be a false dawn, as they would finish 7th in 1948 and 49, then 5th in 1950 and 51, but once more picked up again in 1952, finishing 3rd and losing in a prelim. A 6th place finish in 1953 would prove to be the best result for the next 5 seasons, finishing 11th, which was second last in 1954, 9th in 1955, 8th in 1956, and 11th in 1957. But yet again climbed and finished 3rd in 1958, losing in the first round of the finals. Finishing 5th and 2nd, losing in yet another prelim, this time with a new name and identity. And off the back of a 2nd place finish, surely the 60s would prove to be the decade of the Lions. Initially things looked promising, finishing 5th in 1961. But things took a turn for the worse, falling back to 10th in 1962 and in 1963 winning the wooden spoon, with their only win coming against eventual premiers Geelong. Just when things looked their worst, they went winless throughout 1964, picking up a 2nd wooden spoon in as many years. However, things off-field were beginning to fall apart as well, with their traditional home at Brunswick Street falling apart and with the cricket club reluctant to improve their situation, the situation only worsened. Back on field, they would miss out on a 3rd consecutive wooden spoon, only by percentage, in 1965, and they were back to the bottom in 1966 with just 1 win to their name. Back at Brunswick Street, things had gotten so bad that they were forced to play their home games at Princes Park after being rejected by several venues, including the Preston City Oval and Preston. They would avoid the wooden spoon in 1967 on percentage again, and were 1 match clear of the spoon in 1968. They showed glimpses of hope in 1969, winning 7 games and improving to 10th place on the ladder. The dawn of the new decade saw them move to Junction Oval after increasingly high rent charged by Carlton at Princes Park. And things did improve slightly, winning 9 games and coming 9th on the ladder. 1971 would see Fitzroy's charge up the ladder continue, climbing to 6th and even making the grand final of the Night Series competition. 1972 would see them slip back to 6th, then up to 8th in 73 and back down to 11th by 1974, yo-yoing through the bottom half of the ladder for the next few seasons. 9th in 75, 11th in 76, 10th in 77, 9th in 78, which they won the Night Series premiership in, giving hope to their fans approaching the new decade. 1979 would continue this, making finals for the first time since 1960, with a 4th place finish and even winning their first matchup, before falling 116-94 to Collingwood in finals week 2. So once more, on the back of promising results, would this decade be the one? Would Fitzroy re-emerge as champions and raise the flag at Junction Oval in front of their fans? Certainly didn't start well off-field, with their president Frank Bibby considering relocating the club to Sydney, with serious discussions held with officials in Sydney, mostly due to the fact that the club was over $300,000, roughly $1.1 million in today's money, in debt, and that the club was effectively bankrupt. This was incredibly close to happening, with a Fitzroy solicitor even registering the name Sydney Lions. Back on the field, things weren't much better, winning just 4 games and yet another wooden spoon. But 1981 would be a different story, making it to finals in 5th place and actually winning a final against Essendon. They would reach a semi-final against Collingwood, where they had overturned a 38-point half-time deficit to lead the match by 8 points heading into stoppage time. However, late Collingwood goals, including one from Peter Dacos, would see them lose out by a point, 132 to 133. They would drop to 6th in 1982, remarkably in spite of their off-field turmoil. They were able to finish the 3rd place finish in 1983, but lost in the first week to Hawthorn by 4 points. 1984 would see a 5th place finish, but yet again losing in week 1 by nearly 50 points to Collingwood. Following the conclusion of the 1984 season, the team were evicted from their home at the Junction Oval and forced to move to Victoria Park and shared the ground of Collingwood. Their first season at Vic Park would see them slide to 9th, and 1986 would see off-field turmoil reach a boiling point, with debt reaching over $1 million, $3.1 million in today's money, with relocation almost a certainty at this point, with little people believing the club would survive to the next year in Melbourne. Several companies were interested in the purchase and relocation, with 2 companies from Brisbane being the most prominent, as well as another from Canberra. The club would also discuss mergers with Melbourne, St Kilda and Richmond, all of whom were in their own financial hardships. With Melbourne being the most advanced in talk, Ultimately though, none of these would go ahead, with Fitzroy-based company Hecon attempting a purchase, of which the VFL rejected, but would end up sponsoring the club, enabling them to live to see another day. On field, things were much better, with the club finishing 4th and beating Essendon by a point in finals week 1. They would face Sydney at the MCG the next week, despite it being their home game, in which they won by 5 points, setting up a prelim final clash against Hawthorn, which they would lose by 56 points. And at the end of the season, they were forced into moving homes yet again, this time returning to Princes Park to share the ground with Carlton. 1987 would see the introduction of 2 new teams, West Coast and Brisbane, introduced by the AFL to help generate more income to help out impoverished teams like Fitzroy, who began struggling, falling to 11th in the now 14-team competition. 1988 would see them slide to 12th. 1989, from an outside perspective, looked like a good season, finishing 6th. But off-field, things were getting a lot worse, with the situation of the fellow club, the Fitzroy Bulldogs, deteriorating and in need of merging or face liquidation or folding. The 2 clubs sought to merge in order to save their existence. When announced in October, it was met with extreme criticism, mostly from Fitzroy fans, who were able to raise $1.8 million, $4.5 million in today's money, to keep their club afloat in what was known as the fight back. But its ramifications were felt to the Lions, who saw this as an opportunity to save their club. But anyways, the new decade was upon us once more, and this time it didn't feel like an optimistic time for Lions fans. This time it felt like the club was hanging on by the skin of its teeth, and on field it would reflect that, finishing 12th and the next season falling to 14th, winning just 4 games. 1992 would see things on field go better for the Lions, climbing to 10th and winning 9 games. 1993 would see them win 10 games but slip to 11th, and off field they were forced to move venues yet again, beginning to play games at the Western Oval in Footscray, due to the increasing financial pressures and cost of rent at Princes Park. In their first season at the new venue in 1994, they would slip to 14th, claiming just 5 wins. But as just about anyone could tell, the end was near for Fitzroy, with the merger with Melbourne back on the table, as the 2 clubs met in July and went as far as taking it to the AFL Commission before Melbourne backed out due to realising the actual benefits of a merger with Fitzroy were limited, as neither club had a permanent home base or training ground. While this was going on, Fitzroy also met with Hawthorn to discuss the possibility of them merging to create a club, the Hawthorn Lions. However, Fitzroy were extremely interested in the Melbourne deal, so as a result pulled out. Additionally, Fitzroy informed North Melbourne that they were interested in talking with them if the Melbourne deal did not eventuate. So how did this translate to on-field results in 1995? Well, just about as you thought. They finished last, winning only 2 games and sitting on a percentage of 58.2. Off-field, the situation was getting dire, and the Tasmanian government was reportedly interested in buying the club and moving it there. However, these were only speculations. 1996 was the VFL-AFL centenary season, and was a time for all clubs to celebrate their proud histories, and Fitzroy as a founding club should have been doing the same. However, the only thing on the mind of Fitzroy was survival, especially as the AFL has just announced a new team is set to enter the league the next season and is requiring one team to either merge or fold to make way for Port Adelaide. As such, the club began exploring merging with North Melbourne, which got extremely close to happening and was the preferred option by Fitzroy, as it meant staying in Victoria and moving only a small difference of 4 kilometres, compared to 1.3 thousand of Brisbane. However, on the 26th of June, Fitzroy's creditor, the now ruined government investment company, sought to put the club into administration to ensure a debt of over 1.25 million AUD was paid, putting Michael Brennan in charge of the club, and there was serious concern that Fitzroy would not see out the season. However, the AFL stepped in and did pretty much nothing, only granting them enough assistance to see out the season and ensure no losses for any of their other clubs. This effectively signed the fate of Fitzroy then and there, and by the 4th of July, negotiations with North Melbourne were advanced, and details pertaining to the name, song, colours and Guernsey were set to take place. However, later that day, Fitzroy's administrator accepted a bid from the Brisbane Bears to merge and become the Brisbane Lions. Fitzroy, still having to play out the rest of the season, were beat by near 100 points week in, week out, and would not record another win the whole season, as Fitzroy would play their final game in Melbourne against Richmond at the MCG in front of tens of thousands of loyal, die-hard Roy's fans, packing the stands to see their beloved club take the field one last time. And it was not pretty, with Richmond beating the Lions 28-19, 187 to Fitzroy's 5-6-36. The club would travel one last time the next week to Subiaco to play Fremantle, where they would go down by 86 points, and laying Fitzroy to rest at the grand old age of 113. But but the club does technically still exist today. Following the merger, the administrators took almost everything away from the club, leaving nothing more than a board of directors and a few shareholders, and for the next 2 years had to endure the constant threat of liquidation by the Brisbane Lions until in 1999 the charge was removed, and they began regaining assets and copyright to the point where they were able to begin operating the Fitzroy shop in Mordialloc, selling various pieces of Fitzroy merchandise and Guernseys. By 1999 began to sponsor the Coburg Football Club in the VFL, becoming temporarily the Coburg Fitzroy Lions, until they became an AFL affiliate of the Richmond Tigers and changed from Coburg Lions to Tigers in 2001. Meanwhile, the VAFA team Uni Reds became known as the Fitzroy Reds and began playing out of Brunswick Street Oval, with the support of both Brisbane and the old Fitzroy entity. However, as Fitzroy began to grow its assets and finances, the decision was made in 2008 to merge yet again with Fitzroy Reds and replace them in the VAFA for the 2009 season, meaning that the original Fitzroy Football Club was back playing football once more, and the club still plays there to this day, and even won a C-grade premiership in 2018, and technically bringing to end the longest drought by a VFL-AFL club, being 2 years longer than South Melbourne Sydney's. And with that, we do come to the end of today's video. If you did enjoy, please do leave a like and subscribe to the channel, as it does help grow the channel, and I'll see you in the next one.